Good morning. My name is Damon Grosfener, and I will be discussing James Montgomery and his history in the Kansas Territory. In a little preview, I'll be talking about briefly his journey to the Kansas Territory and his events during the pro-slavery domination era, and then during the Free State retaliation era and during the Free State domination era. Most sourcing is going to be from Tommy L. Holman's master's thesis, James Montgomery in Kansas, 1854 to 1863. I highly recommend reading it. It's full of a lot of great details and stuff that in 10 minutes I cannot cover. In 1814, December 22nd, Montgomery was born in Ashtabula County, Ohio. He moved to Kentucky in 1837. He was a Campbellite and a preacher. It was there that he met his first wife, who ends up dying, and he meets his second wife there as well. And they moved to Missouri in 1852, and he's kind of over there waiting for Kansas Territory to open up. And in 1854, he does move into Kansas Territory. So for this next part, 1854 to 1856, pro-slavery domination, I'll be talking about the March 30th, 1855 bogus election, Montgomery kind of observing the crisis, and George Clark's raid. So March 30th, 1855, Governor Andrew Reeder, the first territorial governor, wants a territorial legislator, so he enacts a vote. As we all know, extensive amounts of fraud, and Lynn County, where Montgomery settled, was no different. Montgomery had kind of railed against it and had become an early leader in the events, but no violence is really broken out in that Inland County yet. Fast forward to late 1856, George Clark, and this is after the first burning of Lawrence. This is just barely after the burning of Osawatomie. George Clark, a prominent Southern pro-slavery Georgian, who came to Kansas similar to why Montgomery did, but for opposite reasons, came to attempt to remove all of the Free State men, out of Lynn County. And he does this, and during this, Montgomery ends up being exiled into Missouri. His house is burned down, and Montgomery ends up vowing revenge. Well, in 1856 to 1858, he gets his revenge, and even a little more so, some might argue. I'll be talking about his revenge on Captain Burnett, his building of Fort Montgomery, the battle near Marmaton Valley, the Marie de Cygnes massacre and retaliation, the raid on Fort Scott, the Denver Peace Treaty, and his meetings with John Brown. So, revenge on Captain Burnett. When he is exiled into Missouri, one of the people that helps him is the wife of Captain Burnett, who was one of George Clark's men. He ends up lying and manipulating Captain Burnett into getting him information and names of all the men that helped George Clark kick him out of Lynn County. And so he promptly returns to Lynn County and kidnaps Captain Burnett, steals $250 and 11 horses from the man. So I think he did a pretty good job getting his revenge. George Montgomery, when he gets back, he builds what's known as Fort Montgomery, having his house be burned down, and it kind of became a historical marker there. It's currently been rebuilt, and it's an interesting spot to go see if you haven't. So George Montgomery takes his act of vengeance over to Fort Scott and in the area over by Little Osage, and basically kicks any pro-slavery people out. He says every man of influence in Lynn County who was sustained in the Blue Lodge and its secret machinations and upheld the bogus codes and the pro-slavery Lecompton government, whether by fraud, violence, or murder, was warned to leave the territory in a certain time and take with him his property. This guy, William P. Tomlinson, was partner in crime kind of dealio with James Montgomery, and ended up writing pretty much an autobiography of 1858. That very interesting read. When the second Constitution for Kansas, the Lecompton Constitution, came up for a vote, Montgomery was very much against it, and a lot of people were tricked into voting for it in Lynn County because of George Brown, the editor and owner of the Herald of Freedom. He kind of said, let's just go for it, because if we can get some authority and kind of stuff, we might be able to fix our problem quicker. Montgomery wasn't having any of it, and he told everybody that. And right here in this quote, he talks about after he gave this vote, he picked up the ballot box in the area and smashed it on the ground, let all those votes go through, and everybody kind of agreed with him at the time. So the next event that kind of happens is Montgomery wants to rescue some Free State men from being held without bail in Fort Scott. And so he does this by capturing a pro-slavery man, taking him prisoner, torturing him a little bit, allowing him to overhear plans of Montgomery getting a bunch of men together to burn Fort Scott to the ground, and then accidentally letting the guy get away. Well, the guy accidentally gets away and goes and tells everyone that Montgomery and his men are going to come and burn Fort Scott to the ground. We got to bail. And so a lot of the pro-slavery men in Fort Scott do promptly bail, and they flee over to Missouri. This action of removing the pro-slavery men from Fort Scott angered a lot of people, including the third governor now of Kansas, Mr. Frederick Stanton, and so he sends some federal cavalry down to Fort Scott in order to kind of hopefully keep the peace. Doesn't work. In fact, it doesn't work so much that when Montgomery goes over there in order to help some Free State men deal with some land claims and stuff from pro-slavery men, they end up getting into a battle with the federal troops, and it's the only engagement, I have it right there, where the federal troops were engaged in battle. One federal troop ends up dying, a couple horses die, two of the cavalrymen are wounded, one of Montgomery's men is killed, and after that, everyone's kind of like, let's not let this get too out of hand, because we don't want to cause an actual civil war just yet. After the battle, there was with the federal troops, a couple of his men wanted to loot, and Montgomery said, no, you're not going to be able to loot. Of course, the Marie de Senez massacre occurs on May 19th, 1858, led by Charles A. Hamilton. So after the massacre, Montgomery ends up chasing Hamilton up to Westport and has some confrontations with some of his men, and he gives this quote saying that we're wasting time, and if we don't do this, they're going to laugh at us, one, and he's probably going to get away. Unfortunately, they wasted time, and Hamilton did end up getting away, but he is never seen again in Kansas Territory, specifically Linn County, so I guess that worked. Continuously, Montgomery is not liked by the territorial government, and the new territorial governor, John Denver, ends up signing a warrant for his arrest, and that is enacted by U.S. Marshal Walker, who is sent to, arrest Montgomery. Well, when he meets Montgomery, Montgomery is giving a speech, and there's a bunch of Free State men, so Walker decides better, and instead decides to gather up a posse of those men in order to arrest George Clark. Montgomery ends up tagging along, disguised, on the trip to Fort Scott, and when they get there, he arrests George Clark. Walker arrests George Clark and discovers Montgomery and ends up arresting both of them. However, he doesn't actually have authority to arrest George Clark, so he leaves Clark in Fort Scott in order for them, the court there, to do what they should, which is try George Clark. And he decides to take Montgomery to Lecompton in order for him to stand trial there. Unfortunately, the men in Fort Scott just say, oh, well, now he's gone. He was living here anyway. George Clark, you're free to go. There you go. So Marshal Walker is an honorable man, and he says, well, you came to me and surrendered to me, Montgomery, on the understanding that Clark was going to face judgment. Clark doesn't face judgment, so I'm going to release you too. And so nothing really comes of it. That is until Montgomery gets released by Marshall, and on June 6, 1858, he gets a group of men to go burn Fort Scott down. well, this doesn't work because there's a bunch of heavy rain, and so they light some of the buildings on fire, but they don't really catch, unfortunately. And this leads Governor Denver in order to go to Mound City for peace talks between the two factions. When the governor ends up going down to Mound City, he meets with Montgomery and is kind of swayed by Montgomery, which is not going to be the last time that Montgomery sways the governors, into kind of seeing his perspective. And Governor Denver signs what is ostensibly known as the Denver Peace Treaty, which prescribes a bunch of stuff, but most importantly, removing federal troops from Fort Scott, and abandoning violence of all parties of armed men, including Montgomery, but also including the pro-slavery men. And this ultimately leads to a few months of quiet. During this few months of quiet, Montgomery ends up meeting John Brown sometime early or late 1858, but we know for a fact it was before July 12th, because on July 12th, 1858, he ends up signing the Shubel-Morgan Articles of Agreement for the Shubel-Morgan's Company. And of course, Shubel-Morgan is an alias for John Brown, so we know for a fact they had contact, and Montgomery and him were kind of, at this point, working together. So here we get to the Free State domination. Montgomery's kind of won his game, 1858 to 1861. I'm going to talk about some new hostilities and the Sugar Mound Treaty, the rescue of Benjamin Wright, Governor Metaire's amnesty bill, Montgomery's run for territorial House seat, his failed attempt to rescue Aaron Stevens and Albert Hazlett, and the Wide Awakers. So new hostilities end up arising on October 30th, 1858, when there's an assassination attempt on Montgomery at his home in Fort Montgomery. It doesn't end up working, but this, unfortunately, causes a lot of issues to come to the surface that Denver's peace treaty had kind of glossed over and, made work. Unfortunately, this action is reported to Territorial Governor Hugh Walsh, yet another one, and Walsh is under the assumption that this was a false flag operation, if you will, and that Montgomery just wanted to go out jayhawking again instead of an actual attempt. And there's no real evidence that that's the case, but that was what Hugh Walsh made the assumption of. And so there's continuing attempts to arrest James Montgomery at this time. And he ends up signing the Sugar Mound Treaty, which is basically just, okay, guys, I'm serious about peace, and here I am. I shouldn't be held to convict for my crimes, and no one else should be for the crimes for the past couple of years. Otherwise, everybody's going to prison. And we need to really stop the violence, because it's pretty obvious we won and you lost. And so it ends up being that Hugh Walsh sends this letter to people in his government. I think this might have been stopped if I had means to offer rewards, and so he offers $300 for Montgomery and $500 for John Brown. These ultimately don't work, but he asked for like $3,000 for the capture of these men that aren't the ones really doing a lot of the issues, although there are people abusing the name of Jayhawkers in Montgomery in order to pillage and raid, but not sanctioned by Montgomery. Well, Benjamin Rice, who was he was an associate with Montgomery and was with him at the battle near Marmaton, and he ends up getting arrested by George Clark, so that guy's still running around. Always great. And he ends up getting held at the Free State Hotel in Fort Scott. You kind of see a disagreement between Brown and Montgomery, because Brown wants to completely burn Fort Scott to the ground, much like Montgomery did, and wanted to kill anyone who got in his way. Montgomery at this point is kind of like, maybe the better route might just be to try and not kill anyone and just rescue Rice. Unfortunately, there is one man, John Little, who has died, and a lot of people are upset about it. The guy woke up. There's a bunch of armed men around the state. There's shots going off, and so he's like, I'm going to defend myself, and he does, and is unfortunately killed. And once he dies, there's some looting that Montgomery was incapable of stopping with from his posse. This unfortunately causes some rising tensions, as you can imagine, and the new territorial governor, again another one, Samuel Maderi, ends up creating a special court in order to try Montgomery for his previous crimes, violating the Sugar Mound Treaty, violating the Denver Peace Treaty, and all this stuff. And of course, John Brown ends up raiding through Missouri at this time. And so this is, kind of 1859. Montgomery ends up receiving this letter from your friend. It's assumed it's John Brown talking about his raid. And there's a bunch of people that are just blaming Montgomery and associating him with Brown for their reign of terror in Lynn County, which is unfortunate because, again, Montgomery is not doing any of this. He has settled down, although he does still support some stuff. He's like, yeah, sure, I support it. You find a bad pro-slavery guy, hang him. I don't care, but I'm not going to do it. And so now we get to 1859 to 1861, which I like to call the end of blood for now. In January of 1859, Montgomery goes to Lawrence a couple of times, and he turns himself in twice for things. He turns himself in, being a good guy, makes bail both times through the help of some abolitionist friends that he has. And he ends up convincing Territorial Governor Maderi in order to sign an amnesty bill, in order to basically forgive him and basically forgive everybody for events that happened in that time period. Now, that it's not solid, doesn't work, but it's a right step in the direction. And then in November of 1859, he campaigns for a territorial House legislature seat. He doesn't end up winning, and a bunch of people send him letters that are like, fight it, it was fraudulent. And he's like, no, it's not. I lost, unfortunately. In February of 1860, there's a rescue attempt that he has with to rescue Stephen Aarons and Albert Hazlett, two men involved in the Harper's Ferry raid, led by John Brown, and ends up being called on account of rain and the fact that they don't have the funding or the ability to really do it. So they end up abandoning it. In April 1860, Montgomery is elected to go to the Republican convention in order to select Republican electors and stuff. And he forms the White Awakers, which is basically a anti-fugitive slave kind of thing, kind of taking up the mantle almost a little bit about John Brown and letting free slaves and stuff come over. And this gets him in a lot of trouble with people because the feds don't like it, and they're stealing his mail because they're like, this is treason. And you got to think, this is 1860, so there's a lot of political bad stuff happening. And so he ends up getting a little having his mail stolen and stuff. There's a couple more attempts to arrest him. They don't end up working. And on June 24th, 1861, he does end up being commissioned Colonel of the Kansas 3rd Regiment of Volunteers. And, well, that ends up becoming a story for another day. I like this one. I'm employing my time in extending our Wide Awake organization and taking care of our fugitives, because he genuinely thought that the safest place for them was not Canada, but it was in Kansas. And this is very interesting. It's his appointment to colonel that happened. There was a lot of times in this where he fought the Federal, specifically Nathaniel Lyon, who ends up being stationed in St. Louis a little bit later and fighting along on the same side with some of the men that during Bleeding Kansas he was fighting against. Overall, that's James Montgomery. Interesting man, and I wish I had more time and didn't have to speed run this to talk about him. And I know it was still a little bit long, but thank you all for listening.